The sun rose slowly over the dusty plains of Red Hollow, painting the wide Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Morning usually brought hope to the little frontier town. Ranchers prepared their horses, blacksmiths lit their forges, and children chased one another along the wooden sidewalks. But on this particular day, an uneasy silence settled over the town. Even the wind seemed reluctant to blow. Among the people of Red Hollow, no one was more respected than Daniel Carter. Daniel wasn't the fastest gunslinger or the richest rancher. He was simply an honest cowboy who believed a man's word was worth more than gold. Every sunrise found him repairing broken fences, helping neighbors gather lost cattle, or sharing food with families who had fallen on hard times. Many people wondered why a man like Daniel had never become wealthy. His answer was always the same. A man can lose his money and earn it back. Lose your honor once, and it may never return. His greatest treasure wasn't his small ranch or the handful of horses he owned. It was his 8-year-old son, Ethan. Every evening after work, Daniel taught Ethan how to ride, how to track animals across the prairie, and most importantly, how to treat people with kindness. Never pull your gun before your heart tells you there's no other choice, Daniel often said. Ethan admired his father more than anyone in the world. But not everyone in Red Hollow admired Daniel. Across the valley stood the enormous ranch owned by Victor Blackwood, the richest man in 3 counties. Blackwood had built his fortune by buying struggling ranches for almost nothing. Some whispered he used threats instead of honest deals. Others believed people who stood against him simply disappeared. No one dared accuse him openly. Even Sheriff Harold Briggs owed his position to Blackwood's influence. One hot afternoon, Daniel refused to sell his ranch after Blackwood offered him a price far below its value. "You'll regret this," Blackwood warned, his cold blue eyes fixed on Daniel. Daniel simply tipped his hat. Land earned honestly isn't for sale to dishonest men. The insult spread through town within hours. Blackwood smiled politely in public, but behind closed doors, his anger grew into something far darker. 3 nights later, the town was awakened by gunfire. Thomas Reed, another ranch owner who had publicly argued with Blackwood, was found dead near the river. The sheriff quickly gathered a posse. To everyone's surprise, Daniel Carter's revolver was discovered lying beside the body. There was blood on the handle. Several townspeople gasped. Daniel stared at the weapon in disbelief. "That's my revolver," he whispered, "but I lost it 2 days ago." Sheriff Briggs ignored the explanation. "Save it for the judge." Daniel was arrested before sunrise. His ranch was searched, and another piece of evidence appeared, a leather money pouch supposedly belonging to Thomas Reed. Daniel had never seen it before. Ethan cried as deputies handcuffed his father. "Papa, tell them they're wrong." Daniel knelt despite the chains around his wrists. "Listen to me, son." His voice remained calm. The truth doesn't stop being true just because people refuse to believe it. The trial lasted less than a single afternoon. No witnesses defended Daniel. Those who knew he was innocent were too frightened of Victor Blackwood's power to speak. The judge barely examined the evidence. Sheriff Briggs confidently claimed the case was solved. Before sunset, the verdict echoed through the silent courtroom. Guilty. The sentence was immediate. Death by hanging. A shocked silence filled the room. Daniel never begged. He never cursed. He simply looked toward Ethan, who stood trembling beside an elderly neighbor. The execution was scheduled for sunrise the following morning. As dawn painted the sky red, nearly the entire town gathered around the wooden gallows. Some came seeking justice. Others came because curiosity had overcome compassion. Daniel climbed the steps without resistance. The rope was placed around his neck. The preacher quietly asked if he wished to say any final words. Daniel slowly looked across the crowd until his eyes found Ethan. The frightened boy clutched his father's old cowboy hat against his chest. Daniel spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. You may take my life. He paused. But you cannot bury the truth. The crowd fell silent. Then he looked directly at his son. Ethan, never let hatred guide your hand. Let the truth guide your heart. Tears streamed down Ethan's face. Daniel drew one final breath. One day, my son will return, and prove I was innocent. The trapdoor opened. A gasp swept through the crowd. Some lowered their heads in shame. Others walked away without looking back. Only one small boy remained standing beneath the gallows long after everyone else had gone. Holding his father's weathered cowboy hat tightly against his chest, Ethan whispered through his tears. I promise, Papa. I'll come back. As the wind carried dust across the empty square, no one noticed a tall man watching from the hill beyond the cemetery. Hidden beneath his coat was a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials TR. He turned his horse toward the distant mountains and disappeared without a word. The truth had not died that morning. It had only begun to wait. 25 years passed. Red Hollow no longer looked like the town that had gathered beneath the gallows. The dusty streets were wider, new brick buildings stood where old wooden shops had once leaned, and the railroad had brought merchants, travelers, and strangers from every corner of the frontier. But some things had never changed. People still lowered their voices whenever someone mentioned the name Daniel Carter. His execution had become part of the town's history, a story told to children as if justice had been served. Only a handful of elderly residents remembered the fear that had silenced them on that terrible morning. On a cold autumn evening, a lone rider approached Red Hollow. He wore a faded brown duster coated in trail dust. His hat hid most of his face, and an old leather saddlebag rested against his horse. Across his shoulder hung a worn rifle that looked as old as the frontier itself. The rider stopped beneath the weathered sign at the edge of town. His eyes settled on the words burned into the wood. Welcome to Red Hollow. He whispered quietly. I'm home, Father. The rider was Ethan Carter. No longer the frightened boy who had watched his father die, Ethan had become a calm, determined man in his early 30s. During the past 25 years, he had traveled across the West, working as a ranch hand, stagecoach guard, and trail scout. Everywhere he went, he searched for anyone who had known Daniel Carter. Most people remembered only one thing. Your father wasn't the kind of man they claimed he was. That was enough to keep Ethan searching. Inside his saddlebag rested two possessions that never left his side. The first was Daniel's old cowboy hat. The second was a leather journal given to Ethan years earlier by the mysterious rider who had disappeared after the execution. The stranger had found Ethan living with relatives and handed him the journal without explaining much. Your father told me to keep this hidden until you were old enough to understand, the man had said before riding away forever. The journal contained Daniel's daily notes, names of ranchers, business deals, and repeated warnings about Victor Blackwood. One sentence appeared again and again. If anything happens to me, don't trust the sheriff. Ethan checked into the town's small boarding house under a different name. He didn't want anyone to know why he had returned. The following morning, he began asking quiet questions around town. Most people claimed they remembered nothing. Others simply walked away. Fear still lived in Red Hollow. Near sunset, Ethan entered the old blacksmith shop. The forge was now run by an elderly man named Samuel Harris. Samuel froze the moment he saw Daniel's weathered cowboy hat resting in Ethan's hands. His face turned pale. Where did you get that? Ethan answered softly. It belonged to my father. The old blacksmith stared for several long seconds. Finally, tears filled his eyes. Daniel Carter. He lowered his hammer. I've waited 25 years to tell someone the truth. They locked the shop doors. Samuel spoke in little more than a whisper. Your father never murdered Thomas Reed. Ethan remained silent. He wanted facts, not hope. Samuel continued. The night Reed died, I saw Victor Blackwood's foreman riding toward the river. He wasn't alone. 2 armed men were with him. Why didn't you testify? Ethan asked. Samuel looked toward the floor. Because the next morning my barn burned down, and someone nailed a warning to my door. The old man swallowed hard. It said, "Speak, and your family dies next." For 25 years, guilt had haunted him. Before Ethan left, Samuel handed him a small rusted key. "This opens the cellar beneath the abandoned Carter Ranch." Why would my father's ranch matter? Samuel looked around once more before answering. Because your father hid something there the day before he was arrested. That night, Ethan rode to the ranch where he had spent his childhood. The house had collapsed years earlier. Broken fences disappeared beneath tall grass. Only memories remained. Guided by moonlight, Ethan found the old cellar door beneath the ruins. The rusted key turned with difficulty. The wooden door groaned open. Carrying a lantern, Ethan climbed down into the darkness. Dust covered everything. Broken barrels lined the walls. At the back of the cellar stood a loose stone unlike the others. Daniel had carved a tiny star into it. Ethan recognized the mark immediately. His father had used the same symbol whenever he wanted to hide something important. With trembling hands, Ethan pulled the stone away. Behind it rested a small iron box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay several folded land contracts, a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials TR, and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For my son." Ethan carefully opened the letter. It was written in Daniel Carter's unmistakable handwriting. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then I was right. They never intended to let me live." His hands began to shake. The letter explained that Thomas Reed had secretly gathered proof that Victor Blackwood had stolen ranches through fraud, intimidation, and murder. Reed had planned to testify before a federal land investigator. Daniel had promised to help him. But someone had learned of their plan. Before Ethan could finish REA. The voice echoed through the abandoned ranch house. "Bring me the box, or you leave here the same way your father did." Ethan remained perfectly still in the darkness beneath the floor. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then the cellar door creaked open. Moonlight spilled down the wooden steps as a tall figure descended with a rifle in his hands. The man was old now, his hair gray beneath a weathered hat, but Ethan recognized him from the faded photographs hidden inside his father's journal. It was Cal Mason, Victor Blackwood's former foreman. The same man Samuel Harris had seen riding toward the river on the night Thomas Reed was murdered. Cal swept the lantern across the cellar. "Come out," he growled. "You've been chasing ghosts long enough." Instead of reaching for his revolver, Ethan stepped into the light with his hands visible. "I'm not here for revenge." Cal laughed bitterly. "You're Daniel Carter's boy. Revenge is exactly why you've come." "No," Ethan replied calmly. "I came for the truth." For a brief moment, the old foreman's hard expression faltered. Then he raised the rifle. Before he could pull the trigger, another voice rang through the cellar. "Drop the weapon, Cal." Sheriff Benjamin Walker rushed down the stairs with 2 deputies behind him. Walker was the newly elected sheriff of Red Hollow. Unlike the corrupt lawmen before him, he had secretly been helping Ethan after learning about Samuel Harris's testimony. Cal looked toward the deputies, then back at Ethan. Realizing there was no escape, he slowly lowered the rifle. As the deputies placed him in handcuffs, Cal whispered, "Blackwood promised nobody would ever know." By sunrise, news had spread across every street in Red Hollow. The courthouse was overflowing. Farmers, merchants, ranchers, and elderly townspeople crowded inside, eager to learn why the long-forgotten Carter case had suddenly returned. At the front of the courtroom sat Victor Blackwood. Age had bent his back, but wealth had never left him. He still wore an expensive black suit and carried himself like the most powerful man in the county. When Ethan entered carrying the iron box, the room fell silent. Sheriff Walker stood before the crowd. 25 years ago, he began. This town executed Daniel Carter for the murder of Thomas Reed. He paused. Today, we will finally hear the complete truth. One by one, the evidence was placed before the judge. Thomas Reed's engraved pocket watch. The hidden land contracts proving Blackwood had illegally seized dozens of ranches. Daniel Carter's journal describing repeated threats against both men. Finally, the sealed letter written by Daniel himself. The judge carefully read every page. The courtroom became so quiet that the ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than breathing. Then Samuel Harris slowly stood. For the first time in 25 years, the old blacksmith publicly told everyone what he had witnessed on the night of the murder. His voice shook with regret. I stayed silent because I was afraid. Tears filled his eyes. Every day since then, I've lived with that shame. Others began rising from their seats. A former stable hand admitted seeing Cal Mason steal Daniel's revolver days before the murder. An elderly shopkeeper confessed she had watched Blackwood secretly pay Sheriff Briggs after the trial. The lies that had survived for decades collapsed one after another. Finally, Sheriff Walker turned toward Cal Mason. Tell this court what happened beside the river. Cal closed his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his shoulders slumped. Thomas Reed discovered everything. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Mr. Blackwood ordered me to stop him. The courtroom gasped. I never meant to kill Reed, but once it happened, Blackwood blamed Daniel Carter. Cal looked toward Ethan. Your father fought like a lion, but there were too many of us. Victor Blackwood suddenly leaped to his feet. He's lying. But panic had already replaced confidence. Sheriff Walker calmly placed one final document before the judge. It was a signed confession. Hidden inside the iron box was a letter written by Blackwood's own accountant shortly before his death, detailing the bribes, stolen land, and the conspiracy to frame Daniel Carter. The judge slowly removed his glasses. He looked directly at Victor Blackwood. Do you deny this evidence? For the first time in his life, the richest man in Red Hollow had no answer. His silence said everything. Deputies stepped forward. Heavy iron handcuffs clicked around Victor Blackwood's wrists. The same townspeople who had once admired him now watched in complete silence as he was led away. No one spoke. No one defended him. Justice had arrived 25 years late. But it had arrived. That evening, nearly the entire town gathered beneath the old oak tree where Daniel Carter had been buried. Fresh wildflowers covered the once-forgotten grave. Even people whose parents had condemned Daniel stood quietly with bowed heads. The judge stepped forward carrying an official document. He read aloud. By order of the Territorial Court, Daniel Carter is hereby declared completely innocent of all crimes for which he was wrongfully convicted. His honor, property, and good name are fully restored. A gentle breeze crossed the prairie. Many in the crowd wiped tears from their faces. Samuel Harris removed his hat. Forgive us, Daniel. One by one, others followed. Ethan walked toward the grave carrying the old cowboy hat his father had worn on the day of his execution. For 25 years he had protected it from dust, rain, and time. He gently placed it on the headstone. Then he unfolded Daniel's final letter one last time before carefully tucking it beneath the hat. Looking at the sunset stretching across the endless plains, Ethan smiled through tears. You were right, Father. His voice was steady. They took your life. He paused, remembering the words spoken beneath the gallows. But they could never bury the truth. The wind rustled through the tall grass as if carrying Daniel Carter's spirit across the valley he had loved. Sheriff Walker walked over beside Ethan. What will you do now? He asked. Ethan looked across the ranchland that had finally been returned to his family. A small group of children laughed in the distance, chasing one another through the open fields where fear had once ruled. He smiled. I'll rebuild what my father lost. Not with anger. With honor. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Red Hollow entered a new chapter. The gallows that had stolen an innocent man's life were torn down a week later. In their place, the townspeople built a simple stone memorial engraved with words every traveler would read before entering the town. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Truth always finds its way home. And for generations to come, whenever parents in Red Hollow told their children the story of Daniel Carter, they no longer spoke of a criminal. They spoke of an honest cowboy whose courage outlived his enemies, and of a son who crossed the frontier to fulfill a promise made beneath the shadow of a hanging tree. Because legends are not born from revenge. They are born from truth that refuses to die.